In this chapter, we're going to continue looking at the years from around 1964 to 1968, specifically issues that happened during Johnson's presidency and then up to Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. Lesson objectives. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to analyze the social, political, and economic conditions that existed in urban communities that ignited urban rebellions in the 1960s. And you should be able to identify the ways in which the Vietnam War adversely affected President Johnson's War on Poverty and his Great Society initiatives. So, to set the stage in the mid 1960s and looking at why black radicalism becomes more embraced and the situation in cities during this time. So, for example, in 1965, 29% of black households compared to 8% of white households lived below the poverty line. Almost 50% of non-white families lived in substandard housing compared to about 18% of white families. During this time, there is a drop in people living in poverty, but the percentage of black people living in poverty actually increases overall. In 1965, the black unemployment rate was 8.5%, which was almost twice that of white unemployment rate. It was especially high amongst black teenagers. The passage of civil rights laws and voting rights legislation did not resolve or erase the glaring social, educational, and economic disparities between black and white citizens. And as jobs moved to suburbs to which inner city residents could neither travel to nor relocate, black neighborhoods will become poorer. School dropout rates will also increase, and fragile family structures will weaken. These conditions will lead to militant leaders like the Black Panthers to liken their neighborhoods to exploited colonies kept poor by repressive white political and economic institutions. And we will see examples of different acts of violence that happened over the next couple of years. So one example of anger in the American cities is going to happen in Watts, which is a section of Los Angeles. Watts was 98% black. Its residents suffered from severe overcrowding, high unemployment, inaccessible healthcare facilities, inadequate public transportation, rising crime rates, and growing rates of drug addiction. The poverty, combined with anger at the often brutal behavior of the Los Angeles police force in Watts, will prove to be an incendiary situation. On August 11th, a policeman pulls over a young black man to check him for drunk driving. The man was arrested, but not before a crowd had gathered. The policeman called for reinforcements, and when they arrived, the crowd pelted them with stones, bottles, and other objects, and within hours, Watts was in a total riot. The governor at the time, a Democrat, sent in National Guard to restore order, but by the sixth day, Watts had been reduced to rubble and ashes. 34 people had been killed, more than 900 injured, and 4,000 arrested, and the property damage was in the millions. And during this time, the Watts Rebellion will be seen as the beginning of 4 summers of uprisings that would engulf cities in the North and in the Midwest. Other examples of anger in American cities. Next one will be in Newark, New Jersey. Newark, New Jersey is a city of 400,000 residents, and the majority by 1967 were black. But the city operated on an inadequate tax base and under white political control. The school system had deteriorated, unemployment had increased. In 1967, Newark had the highest unemployment rate among black men in the nation. On July 12th, after a black cab driver in police custody was beaten, protesters gathered at a police station near the Hayes Home housing project. When a firebomb hit the wall of the station house, the police charged, clubbing the crowd. This would trigger one of the most destructive civic rebellions of the period. During 4 days of rioting, the police and National Guard killed 25 black people, most of them innocent bystanders, including 2 children. A white policeman and firemen were also killed, and widespread looting and arson will cause millions of dollars in property damage. A few days after Newark, there is an incident that happens in Detroit. Detroit seemed like it was a city that was doing well and was a model of prosperity and the home of Motown, but that prosperity didn't come for everybody. So, on the night of July 23rd, the police will raid an after hours drinking establishment in the black community where more than 80 people were celebrating the return of two veterans from Vietnam. The raid's going to trigger 5 days of rioting, and people are going to refuse to disperse. Of the 59 urban rebellions that occurred in 1967, Detroit's was the deadliest. 43 black people died, most of them shot by members of the National Guard, which were sent in by the Republican Governor George Romney. But even the National Guard, combined with 200 state police and 600 Detroit police, could not restore order. President Johnson then had to send in 4,700 troops from two different units to Detroit. Republicans often criticized Johnson in his move. They felt like it was designed to embarrass the current governor, as this current governor was planning on running as president in 1968. After the Newark and Detroit riots, President Johnson will establish the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, and it will be headed by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner. And in this group, it will also include two black members, Senator Edward W. Brooke of Massachusetts, who is a Republican, and Roy Wilkins, the executive director of the NAACP. Johnson said that the solution was to attack conditions that breed despair. The Kerner Commission indicted white racism as the underlying cause of the riots and warned that America was, quote, moving towards two societies, one white and one black, separate and unequal. Negroes firmly believe that police brutality and harassment occur repeatedly in Negro neighborhoods. This belief is unquestionably one of the major reasons for intense Negro resentment against the police. Physical abuse is only one source of aggravation in the ghetto. In nearly every city surveyed, the commission heard complaints of harassment of interracial couples, dispersal of social street gatherings, and the stopping of Negroes on foot or in cars without objective basis. And this was a quote from the Kerner Commission. The report called for massive government aid to the cities, including funds for public housing, better and more integrated schools, 2 million new jobs, and funding for a national system of income supplementation. None of these proposals were ever enacted. So the urban rebellions of the late 60s, they end up undercutting support for the broadest attack the federal government had yet waged on the problems of poor Americans. And Johnson called this in his campaign the Great Society. And Johnson wanted to push in Congress things that would help those who were without. So Johnson was a savvy politician, and he had deep sympathy for the disadvantaged. He had even worked with the disadvantaged in his jobs prior to politics. He wanted to create programs such as the Economic Opportunity Act, which was a federal law creating the Office of Economic Opportunity and programs aimed at poor communities. And this was his cornerstone for the war on poverty. Other programs he wanted to set up: Head Start, which would provide preschool education for lower income students; Upward Bound, which would prepare impoverished teenagers for college; and VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, which served as a type of domestic Peace Corps to help in underprivileged neighborhoods. The first government effort to involve poor African Americans in designing and implementing programs to serve income communities will be in community action programs. And this is an anti-poverty program involving maximum feasible participation by the poor themselves. There were many local politicians who were opposed to caps. Some felt that they were threatened by the empowerment of previously disfranchised individuals. Some complained that Johnson was rewarding laziness with handouts and rewarding lawlessness to the undeserving poor. Black residents in inner cities had expectations raised, but they were frustrated and they felt betrayed by these programs. And one of the major issues that happens is the resources needed to make this work end up being diverted to the war in Vietnam. Government spending, including spending for domestic programs, is going to increase dramatically under Johnson, but most of the money spent on domestic programs during his presidency went to Social Security benefits, which now includes Medicare. Appropriations for the war on poverty came in at about $10 billion of the budget. The war in Vietnam consumed $140 billion of the budget. big event of Johnson's that ends up consuming Johnson's presidency, and some believe ending his political career, is the war in Vietnam. Now, Vietnam was a French colony, and it is a colony from the 1860s until the Japanese seized control of it during World War II. After the war, Vietnamese communists declare independence, but the French, with massive U.S. financial aid, fought to reassert their control until they were finally defeated in 1954. Americans then arranged a division of Vietnam with a communist-led North and a U.S.-supported South. So for 9 years under Eisenhower and Kennedy, they're going to provide aid and advisors to help prop up the South Vietnamese government, it was corrupt, it was seen as incompetent, but it was not communist. By the time Johnson became president, only the dramatic escalation of American involvements, such as the bombing in North Vietnam and the introduction of large numbers of American troops into combat, could keep the South Vietnamese government in power. Johnson was often having internal conflict about whether or not he should get involved in this war. He even once said, quote, "But if I left that war and let the communists take over South Vietnam, then I would be seen as a coward and my nation would be seen as an appeaser, and we would both find it impossible to accomplish anything for anybody anywhere on the entire globe." So after the North Vietnamese allegedly attacked the U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, Johnson pushed a resolution through Congress that gave him the authority to escalate involvement in Vietnam. By the spring of 1965, Johnson had authorized bombing of North Vietnamese targets. However, this does fail to stop the North Vietnamese from reinforcing their forces in the South. During this time, the American military presence will grow rapidly. In 1966, there were 385,000 U.S. troops that were stationed in Vietnam, and by 1968, there was over 500,000 troops. In the mid-1960s, Black Americans made up about 10% of the armed forces. The percentage increased during the Vietnam War. So, for example, in 1969, 18% of active duty soldiers were Black. Black overrepresentation among the U.S. troops in Vietnam resulted in large part to draft deferments for college and graduate students who were predominantly white and middle class. And this ends up contributing to that higher number of Black troops. Black people will enter the military for reasons other than the draft. One will be patriotism. Another one is that the military offered educational and vocational opportunities that the children of working Black poor could not otherwise obtain. And another will be something called Project 100,000. This is launched by the Department of Defense in 1966, and the goal of this is to reduce the number of African Americans that are rejected by the military. This is going to allow recruitment officers to accept applicants who might have been rejected for criminal records or lack of skills. This is going to end up supplying more than 340,000 new recruits to Vietnam. 136,000 of them were Black. This group will end up seeing more combat duty than the regular recruits. By the end of 1967, the nation seemed to be heading towards total racial polarization. In their rage against economic exploitation and police brutality, some inner-city Black people had destroyed their own neighborhoods. Frightened white people, unable to comprehend Black anger, rallied behind those who promised to restore order by any means. Even the two who were the biggest advocates of racial reconciliation, Lyndon B. Johnson and Martin Luther King, end up trying to regain initiative, and they end up, unfortunately, alienating each other. By 1967, the war it's not looking good for Johnson. He had escalated the war in Vietnam without convincing many Americans that it was worth fighting. Misleading claims about the progress of the war had forfeited public trust and opened what journalists called the credibility gap. Johnson hoped with more bombings and more troops, the Vietnamese communists would give up. But he knew if Congress had to choose between spending on war and spending on domestic programs, it would choose war. And after Johnson asked for a tax increase, his Great Society programs will meet increasing resistance. Another dramatic example of the mood on Capitol Hill will be the expulsion in 1967 of the most prominent African American politician in the United States, Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. He was a pastor in Harlem and a longtime civic activist, and he was first elected to represent his district in 1944 and became a champion of civil rights in the House. He ended up becoming the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee in 1961 and was instrumental in passing Johnson's education and anti poverty legislation. Now, Powell also had his own issues. He mismanaged the committee's budget, took numerous trips abroad at government expense, was exiled from his district when threatened with arrest there because of his refusal to pay a slander judgment against him. Supreme Court overruling the House upheld his right to his seat, and he actually stays in his seat for Harlem until 1972. So, despite opposition from Congress, Johnson did not give up on the Great Society. He knew he could initiate no major programs while the Vietnam War lasted, but he continued to push measures, including a law to prohibit discrimination in housing. He also named Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court in 1967. So Vietnam really does trap Johnson. As hundreds of thousands of people who demonstrated against the war reminded him, Vietnam was incontestably Lyndon Johnson's war. It was not, he would have replied, the war he wanted to fight. That was the war against poverty and discrimination, but he was committed to seeing it through. He felt like the nation's honor was at stake. Then, on January 30th, 1968, the start of the Vietnamese New Year, communist insurgents will attack 36 of 44 provincial capitals in South Vietnam, as well as its national capital, Saigon, where they penetrated the grounds of the American embassy. Even though the Americans and South Vietnamese recaptured all of the territory that was lost and inflicted massive casualties on the enemy, the Tet Offensive was a major psychological blow for the American public. This also deepened the suspicion that the administration had not been telling the truth about the war. So on March 31st, 1968, Johnson tells the nation that he would halt the bombing of North Vietnam to encourage the start of peace negotiations, which began in Paris in May of that year. He then announced that he would not seek the renomination of president. He was worn out by Vietnam, frustrated in his efforts to achieve the Great Society, the target of bitter criticism, and dispirited by a poor showing in early primaries. He ended his public career rather than engaging in a potentially bruising renomination battle. It's going to lead to the ensuing violence is going to attract nation's television cameras. Chicago's white liberals joined with King and Daley in negotiating an agreement on housing, which amounted to a hasty retreat by King in the face of white rage and black militancy. This Chicago strategy did not end up being successful. Chicago did reinforce two important lessons for King. First, that racial discrimination was more than a Southern problem. In Chicago, he witnessed an intensity of hatred and hostility that surpassed even that of Birmingham. Second, he notes that racial discrimination was inextricably intertwined with the country's economic structure. So, with the Chicago strategy being a bit of a failure, there are some lessons learned. King learns that racial discrimination was more than a Southern problem. In Chicago, he witnessed an intensity of hatred and hostility that surpassed even that of Birmingham. He also noted that racial discrimination was inextricably intertwined with the country's economic structure. He thought of the need to end systemic economic inequality. So by the fall of 1967, he announced his plans for a project called the Poor People's Campaign, and this is to involve the march of tens of thousands of poor people on Washington. The goal of the Poor People's Campaign was to focus attention on the disadvantaged in America's society. King is also going to push for a federally guaranteed income policy. During this time, Martin Luther King will also begin to attack the war in Vietnam. He felt that he considered the hypocrisy of the federal government determined to send black and white men to Vietnam to slaughter people while failing to protect black American civil rights protesters in places like Albany, Birmingham, and Selma. Some of King's comments are going to end up turning President Johnson against him and further alienate King from many of Johnson's black supporters. And by 1968, King becomes one of the most trenchant critics of the war. Dr. Martin Luther King also was searching for a strategy that led him closer to involvement with labor issues. In February 1968, he attempted to gain union recognition for workers in Memphis, which leads to a strike, and together with the local black community, boycotted downtown merchants. This is going to eventually lead to Dr. King going to Memphis to address the striking workers. The occasion is marked by violence, but King does return to Memphis on April 3rd and delivers his last and probably his most prophetic speech about seeing the promised land. The next day, James Earl Ray murdered King as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. His assassination unleashed a torrent of civic rage in black communities. More than 125 cities experienced uprisings. By April 11th, 46 people were dead, 35,000 injured, and more than 20,000 had been arrested. Within days of this happening, Congress will pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This was proposed by Johnson 2 years before, and it outlawed discrimination in the sale and rental of housing and gave the Justice Department authority to bring suits against discrimination. King's assassination also boosted support for the SCLC's Poor People's Campaign. The campaign began in May when more than 2,000 demonstrators settled into a shanty town that they called Resurrection City in Washington, D.C. For more than a month, they marched daily to federal offices and took part in a mass demonstration on June 19th. On June 24th, the police evicted them and the campaign ended, leaving an uncertain legacy. So, as we come to the end of Johnson's presidency, we see that there's still a lot of chaos and anger that's happening, not only in southern cities, but in many of the urban inner cities in the north. And this really is highlighted after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King.